Thank you very much, Amar, and thank you, the Community Church of Boston, for inviting me. This is my second talk to you, and I'm very pleased to be with you. Even though these are very difficult circumstances, I can tell you that this is probably the most difficult time, and I've been through a lot in my life. But seeing the carnage, the mayhem, the killing, the atrocities, the brutality, the criminality, what's going on in Gaza is just makes your heart bleed. And I've been through the same situation back in 1982 when Israel was bombing Lebanon on a daily basis for 77 days. And that was my first adult encounter with seeing this live, because I've also been through the 1967 war, even though it was quickly, brief. It wasn't on the front line. There wasn't much to see, but of course I felt it when that took place. And of course, as a Palestinian, I've been living through the Nakba. Nakba means catastrophe. And it was a catastrophe for the Palestinians. Both of my parents were born in Jaffa, Palestine, which is what Tel Aviv used to be, the suburb of Jaffa. Today, Jaffa is a suburb of Tel Aviv. And that's where they were expelled. My father at the time was 23. My mother was just 10. And they were both expelled there. They went to Gaza, and then from Gaza, my father went to Kuwait. And then we had to leave Kuwait to Egypt. And then I came to the United States when I was 17, and I stayed there for 40 years. And then I had to leave again and come to Turkey. So it's been a journey. And I can tell you, throughout all these years, I've never felt the brutality of what the Israeli regime means like I'm feeling it today. So what I'd like to do today is to discuss this issue from more a historical but also current affairs of how did we get to this stage? How did we get to this phase of that conflict? We have to understand that this is not a religious war, despite what some of the Zionists would like us to believe, and some of the Christian Zionists would like us to believe, that this is somehow a clash of religions or a clash of civilizations. It is not. The history of the Jews inside the Islamic world, the Jewish Encyclopedia describes that as the golden age of the Jews. Islam recognizes Judaism as well as Christianity, so there is no conflict based on religious beliefs or doctrine, because we simply, as Muslims, we recognize them. And we recognize their faith and what they believe in, and there is no injunction by which there has to be an enmity or war or conflict. On the other hand, of course, Judaism does not recognize Islam, but it lived within the Muslim communities throughout history for over 1,300 years. And if we talk about Jewish philosophy, Jewish scholarship, Jewish doctrine, and so on and so forth, that's where it flourished under these societies, particularly in Andalusia. The current problem has nothing, it's not thousands of years old. That is just a lie, another deception they try to promote and advocate. This current conflict actually started because of anti-Semitism that was taking place in the heart of Europe. And that was basically after the Enlightenment, after the nation-state system of Westphalia, after the Jews who were living in ghettos inside Europe were emancipated. And despite all this, despite the fact that they left the ghettos and they started to integrate within different European societies, there was still much anti-Semitism. And some of it on the eastern side, in Russia, Ukraine, and others, they were even facing pogroms. And with that, there was a movement that started within the Jewish communities, even though the majority of these people were not religious. So to them, this was an attempt to emulate the nation-state system, the nationalism that was taking place throughout Europe and much of the world, in trying to establish a Jewish homeland or a Jewish state. This started in the 1890s. There was a book written by now the founder of modern political Zionism, Theodor Herzl. And his theory, even though he was atheist, he was not religious at all, but he looked at this as being a problem for Jews, that Jews cannot integrate with Europe because of what he saw as a journalist when a French officer who was tried for treason in France in 1894, and he thought that he was railroaded and they were about to execute him, not simply because he betrayed his country, France, but because he was a Jew. And he was convinced after this trial that the disease of anti-Semitism will never be cured from Europe, and therefore the only solution for this would be to have a Jewish state. He didn't care what that Jewish state is. So he started shopping around, and eventually when he met some of the religious Zionists who insisted that that Jewish homeland must be in the Holy Land, that's where the Messiah would come in. Then he accepted that idea and started organizing around it. And by the turn of the century, I'm talking about the 20th century, he was totally distraught because his movement was not going anywhere. He died in 1904 thinking that this idea has died. But it was picked up by other Zionists, particularly some of the rich Zionists from England and others. And they started promoting this idea within imperialist Britain. Britain was, at the time, one of the greatest countries. In other words, it's a great power. It was a waning great power, but it was an empire everywhere. And they thought they were fighting, of course, different forces, different great powers. The Ottoman Empire was on its waning days. And the Ottoman Empire controlled this part as part of its empire, as part of the Islamic world, including Palestine. And that's where my grandfather was born. He was born in 1892 in Palestine, and he was an Ottoman. And certainly he fought also in the First World War as an Ottoman. But at the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire was defeated. Palestine was occupied by the British. And during the war, they gave a declaration to one of the probably richest Jew in the world, Baron Rothschild, from England, promising him, and he was an ardent Zionist, that Britain would help to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was not a land without a people, to people without a land. At the turn of the century, the number of Jews in Palestine did not constitute more than 2.5%. Very quickly, by the First World War, there were about 7 or 8%, because the Zionists were trying to push for immigration. And at that time, many of the Jews came because of the anti-Semitism taking place in Europe. They were welcomed as immigrants by the Palestinians. But very quickly after the British Mandate, it became very clear that what we're talking about here is a colonialist settler movement by the Zionist movement that is being pushed and nurtured and helped and aided by the British. There was much talk about Palestinians selling their lands to the Jews, far from the truth. In 1948, after 30 years of the British Mandate, the percentage of land that existed that belonged to the Jewish Agency, which is the agency that was supposedly settling the Jewish communities coming to Palestine, did not own more than 6.5%, despite the grants and the lands that they were given to them by the British, despite some of the land that they purchased, which was mostly not from the Palestinians, but from feudals who were from Lebanon, who were tax collectors for the Ottoman Empire. And with all that, they had only 6.5%. The population of Jews at the time of Zionists, even though it started when the British moved in at about 7 or 8%, even after 30 years of colonization and illegal immigration, did not constitute more than 33%. In other words, there were about 650,000 Jews and about 1.3 Palestinians. But these people who came to colonize the country through a very systematic program. They were aided by the British. They had an army and militias waiting for that moment in which they can declare a country and try to invade and expel as many Palestinians from the land as possible. That took place in 1948 after a year of terror. And this is why the Palestinians call it the Nakba, the catastrophe, where 80% of the Palestinians who lived in the areas that they settled in were totally expelled. They were kicked out, including my parents and my grandparents. And many of them settled in different parts of either Palestine, the West Bank, and Gaza, or even beyond, like Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, and so on and so forth. This is the origin. The conflict did not start on October the 7th. That is just one of the myths that they try to talk about and promote in the media and by politicians. This has been going on now directly for 75 years and indirectly for a century and a quarter. The Palestinians who were kicked out of their homes, there are several UN resolutions that guarantee them the right of return. And I'm talking about resolutions that passed not just the General Assembly, but also the Security Council. Of course, Israel totally rejected to implement any of these resolutions, even though when it was admitted to the United Nations, it was admitted based on the fact that it will comply with the UN resolutions regarding this issue. Of course, it never did. As I said, the partition, because that's something that the United States was pushing, because the United States adopted also during Truman days, President Truman, the Zionist project. It was stipulated that the Israelis would get, or the newborn state would get 55% of the land, the Palestinians would get 45%, even though the Palestinians owned over 93%. Eventually, by 1949, when they had the truce, Israel had conquered much of the land, and it had 78%, 78.5%. What constituted the remaining was Gaza and the West Bank. By 1956, 67, 82, there were successive Israeli invasions, because the Zionist project says that's why Israel does not have a constitution. To have a constitution, that means you have to you have to have a border, you have to define who is a citizen. But the Israel was not created based on to be a country of its citizens. Israel was created as a Jewish state by redefining what a Jew is. So the Zionism, what Zionism did, it no longer looks at Jews as a community of believers. It looks at them as ethnicity. And therefore, any person who was born of a Jewish mother, and they said, we're going to use the same definition that Hitler did, because Hitler was looking at the Jews that he was persecuting in Germany, in Nazi Germany, that if they have 1/8 of a blood or 1/8 of a grandfather or mother or Jew, that he would be considered a Jew. So they redefined that, or at least Ben-Gurion, the founder of the state. So they would accept any Jew around the world, and they will be automatic citizens. Doesn't matter where they came from US, from Russia, from Argentina, Latin America, Europe, Arab countries, India, wherever they come, then they will become automatic citizens, while the indigenous citizens of the country, not only they were kicked out and expelled, they were denied living there. And that is the doctrine, that is the core of the Zionist movement, which is to exclude the indigenous people, the Palestinians, and only admit the Jews and the Jewish Zionists. And that continued. So by 1967, as I said, as they were absorbing these Jewish communities coming from different parts of the world, They further invaded the rest of Palestine. That's when they got the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip, what between 48 and 67, was under Egyptian control, and the West Bank was under Jordanian control. They conquered both. They occupied both, in addition to the Sinai, the Egyptian Sinai, and the Golan Heights in Syria. So the Zionist movement is a movement that also depends on continuous expansion, as well as putting facts on the ground, that you have to, they continue expanding. So it's an expansionist movement as well as an exclusionist movement that excludes Arabs, Muslims, and Christians, and only recognizes this. It's also a supremacist ideology, because it only looks or recognizes Jews as the only people deserving of living in that land and everyone else not. Very similar to white supremacy and how they looked at blacks, or to the apartheid South Africa and how they looked at their black South Africans. And I can give you example after example after example. For example, when you look today in the West Bank, you will find that the roads only for Jews and settlers. There are water fountains, swimming pools, and what have you, all these things that you heard about, from the 1950s during the segregation period, today exist. It's live right before your own eyes. There are roads that no Palestinian can enter. So the Palestinian could be 2 kilometers or a couple of miles from their house, but they have to take a much longer route because these roads are only allowed for Jewish settlers. This is the reality of the Palestinians that they had to endure. This is not only a 75-year ordeal for many Palestinians, it's also direct occupation, because when they occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, you could see that now you have a third generation that have been born within these conditions. The Palestinians under constant military occupation. No Palestinian can build in many of these areas. They can't cultivate safely. You have settlers basically everywhere. Today we have hundreds of settlements in the West Bank. The number of settlers increased since 1993 to today, about 30-year period, from about 125,000 settlers today to about 800,000. That includes Jerusalem. So what we have here is a system that has been designed to try to displace the Palestinians day in and day out, and to forbid them from living as normal human beings. They do not have any legal or political rights. So what you have, not only you have a system for Israelis within the 1948 boundaries, but also within the 1967 in the West Bank. What you have here is two legal systems, one for Israeli settlers and one for Palestinians. And the one for Palestinians, they don't have much rights. They are basically excluded in every aspect of what you would call civilian life. The incursions of the settlers and of the army is almost on a daily basis, particularly after the election of the Netanyahu's government. So when you look at the history of this conflict, you will find that the Palestinians tried every form of resistance. They tried armed resistance in the 1970s and 80s. That ended up, of course, with their displacement from Lebanon. They were first in Jordan, then they went to Lebanon, and from Lebanon they went to different countries after what I told you, the summer of 1982, where they were basically massacred, also 17,000 of them, plus the massacre of Sabra and Shatila, two camps in which, after Israel pledged that the fighters could leave, they gave 3 days to the Christian phalangists, in which they killed 3,000 unarmed women, children, and elderly, like we see today. And that happened in September of 1982. And of course, throughout this period, the United States was part and parcel of supporting and aiding Israel. Between 1973 and today, the United States cast 45 vetoes in the Security Council resolution in order to protect, shield, and shield Israel. 45 vetoes that goes for every single president since 1973. That's Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama, Trump, and Biden. Every one of them cast a veto to protect Israel. That's 45 vetoes out of a total of 84 vetoes that the United States cast in the 78-year history of the United Nations Security Council. So you could see that as if it is Israel who has a veto power, not the United States. In addition to that, the United States, if you're going to count the number, the amount of money, the amount of funds that the US gives Israel since 1973, and adjusted for inflation, that would be over $335 billion. That's with a B, $1 billion, by far exceeds any other conflict or any other country. So the United States has been part of that conflict by choice. Not only to protect Israel politically and diplomatically, and not only that, it funds it. And I didn't even count what is called the loan guarantees, in which Israel could come at will, get $10 billion to resettle Jews in the occupied territories at the expense of Palestinians. And then the United States government would guarantee these loans that mostly would go unpaid, where the US government would come back and pay it for them. Does not even include the billions of dollars that they will give to Israel bonds. These are people who are supporters of Israel within the country, that they get tax-free or tax deduction on these billions of dollars they extend to Israel. So you could see Israel is a construct of the US empire, in which it is created not only because of political pressure of powerful lobbies and powerful entities within the United States, but also it is serving American imperial interests, but making sure that this region would always fall under US control and hegemony. And I will speak about that in a minute. Also, if you look at the amount of weapons that Israel gets from the US, every single bomb, missile, plane that you saw raining on Palestinians in the past couple of months, every one of them is American made. It's American made, American supplied. So this is not a coincidence that the US is a partner in the war crimes that are taking place today. We have today about at least 22,000 people who have been killed, 16,000 accounted for, including 6,000 children. There are about 8,000 that are under the rubble. So it could be as much as 24,000 and still going on, hasn't stopped. We have about close to 40,000 injured people. There's absolutely no military reason for this. It is just the revenge, and it is the attempt by the Israelis to restore back their deterrence. Because what happened on October the 7th, as I said, was a payback, was an attempt by the resistance movement to compel the Israelis to stop what they were doing. And let me give you the 5 reasons why that happened. First of all, as I said, since the election of the last government, it started in January, they thought that they are in a perfect time to end the conflict. This is the most extremist, right-wing, fascist government in the history of the state. The people who comprise this government have said so many things that many people, if they hear it, they would immediately conclude that you are living in a fascist Nazi type government. They called for the Palestinians to accept one of 3 conditions. One is to recognize that this is a Jewish state, a sovereign Jewish state, where they would have no rights. They can live there at the behest and at the pleasure of the Jewish government, and they cannot have any say whatsoever in how this government, how this state is governed and who gets what. And if they do not subject themselves to this fact that they have been defeated and this is a Jewish state, that they have to accept it, then they can be given compensation and they could leave. And if they refuse both options, the only option left to them is death. That is said in black and white, not once, not twice, but every day it was said and repeated. And that's what Smotrich, who is the current finance minister and Netanyahu's partner, as well as Ben-Gvir, who is the security minister in charge of the security portfolio, have been saying. And Netanyahu himself handed over the West Bank settlements to Smotrich, and also the security part to Ben-Gvir. Ben-Gvir took over the prison system and all the privileges, or all the things that the Palestinians gained within the prison system, which took years and years and decades of struggle: visitation rights, the right to education, the right to get certain items in the canteen, the right to see your family or call your family, every single item, in which, by the way, the American prisoners also fought for during the 60s and 70s, and they gained a lot. All these things were taken away in a moment and became, the prison system were intolerable. And he is and still trying to introduce also the death penalty for many of these prisoners. So that is another pressure that the resistance, and Hamas and others found that this cannot continue. But also the incursions on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Jewish Zionists, have been trying to storm the Aqsa Mosque, which is the holiest shrine in Palestine and the third holiest shrine. There are only 3 holiest shrines in Islam. 2 of them are in Saudi Arabia, in Mecca and Medina, and this is the third. And there's a lot of course, history behind this, including the Crusaders. But this particular piece of land, they have been trying to storm and try to impose what they call a division in time and space. In other words, they wanted to take a piece of it, build their third temple, and then they can give some time for the Muslims, hoping that in the future they can take it over. And this has been going on, it's particularly before October 7th, almost on a daily basis for the last 3 months. And they were threatening actually to come and take it over. So this added another pressure on that. In addition, as I said, settlers were trying to determine the end of the conflict. So they were confiscating and building settlements at a very fast pace. Since the beginning of the year, over 256 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank, 20% of which are children. And they would be killed in their homes, in their streets, in their neighborhoods. It's not like the Palestinians are outside their towns and villages. It's the other way around. The Israeli army would come and storm these camps, refugee camps and cities and villages. They try to arrest people, kill them, and come back and leave. And they have a policy of arbitrary arrest. Out of the 5,500 Palestinians who were in prison, in the prison at the time, and I can tell you what happened after October 7th. At the time, there was 1,860 people who were there detained arbitrarily. All the women, most of the women, let's say about 85% of them, who were arrested in the prison system, including children. I mean, just imagine, people say children in prison. That's exactly right. There were people who were in prison and they were at the age of 9 and they got 10 and 15 years for whatever charges that was thrown at them. But anyway, so 1,860 people were not charged with any crime, and they will continue to be detained week after week, month after month, and year after year without any charges whatsoever. And there is no system that can actually deal with that situation. It's all military rule. So add to that pressure as well. Now add to that also that you have a Gaza. Gaza has been under siege for 17 years, since 2007. So for 16 years, Gaza has been under a very crippling siege. You know what that siege means? It means that nothing goes in or out before Israel says so. Not a person, not food items, not medicines, whatever goes in or out, it has to be on the Israeli say-so. And no one is disputing that. And they have been trying everything possible to break that siege, and they always failed, because Israel always carries the day, particularly with the help and aid and protection of the United States, which has been basically a partner of all these crimes. The siege on Gaza, they tried in 2018 doing all kinds of peaceful protests. Flotillas have been organized and sent to break the siege by unarmed civil society groups. What happened? Israel would go and take over these flotilla, and in one instant actually kill 10 unarmed people. These are totally unarmed attempts in order to break the siege, and every time Israel faced that with brutality and killing. When Palestinians would be demonstrating and protesting at the border in order to break the siege, totally unarmed, what Israel would do is to shoot at them. They killed hundreds, literally hundreds, and they maimed hundreds more while they're trying to break and protest what was happening. So nothing is working. For 30 years, the people on the other side who represented the Palestine Liberation Organization, who totally said, okay, we're going to try it the US way. US was pressuring it. You need to denounce violence. You need to denounce terrorism. This is all terrorism. You need to recognize Israel, and then we'll give you a state. That happened back in 93 with the promise that in 5 years, so they established the Palestinian Authority in 94. Within 5 years, you will have your own state, even though many Palestinians not only were skeptical, but they were against the fact that I don't have the right to return. This has nothing to do with me. My parents were not kicked out of the West Bank. They were kicked out of Jaffa, and I need to go back to Jaffa. I need to honor that pledge. This is my hometown. This is my country. But even the Palestinian Authority did that. The Israelis have no intention whatsoever to honor any of that. Actually, when they recognized the PLO, they didn't recognize any Palestinian right. The Palestinians recognized Israel on 78%, but what they said, we'll recognize the PLO, that will be our negotiating partner. And then, of course, with the imbalance of power, they never had a chance. And the United States was never an honest broker. It was always a dishonest broker, always sided with Israel, trying to push the Palestinians to accept something that would never be accepted. That it's not actually a state, but it is, it's a truncated state, akin the Bundestans that the South Africans used to have under the apartheid regime, which the Palestinians, even those who compromised, couldn't accept. And of course, with Netanyahu, he said, I would never even accept or even negotiate a Palestinian state. So that path is dead set. There is absolutely, every time you hear a two-state solution from any politician in the US or otherwise, you need to know that these people are lying. They know fully well. At the time when Obama, in his last days in office, he said it, Kerry, who was his Secretary of State, he said it, said there's no two-state solution, it's over. There is no more possibility for a viable state. So forget about the two-state solution. That's never going to happen. So every time, Biden or other these people, they open their mouth and said, we need a partner for a two-state solution, that either they are deceiving themselves or deceiving their people, and they know better, or they are just, plain lying because they know this is not going to happen. And that the principal reason for not that happening is because Israel never intended to withdraw from any place. No one is going to withdraw and at the same time settle hundreds of thousands of people with hundreds of thousands of houses and hundreds of thousands of other institutions, schools and universities and factories and plants and agricultures and industries and so on and so forth. Do you think these people will have any plan in withdrawing? Of course not. I mean, they put billions of dollars into these things. All what they're trying to do is how to manage the Palestinians and get them out and displace them and get rid of them because of the demographic problem that they are having. So by this year, Netanyahu and his government thought that their tactic has been working. They were able to outmaneuver every American administration, even though it wasn't in the interest of the Americans to keep this in the background. But they were telling them, don't worry about it. We're taking care of it. We have this policy called mowing the lawn. Every time the Palestinians, will have a little bit of strength, we're going to go and bomb the hell out of them and get rid of them. And that's what happens. They continue going to Gaza and bomb the people and the resistance. And of course, with every time they would be killing over half of which would be children. They did that in 2008, 2009. They did that in 2012. They did that in 2014. They did that in 2018. They did that in 2020 and 21 and 22. Every year or two, they will send their planes and they will bomb and they would kill people and say, okay, now we're going to get quiet for another year. So meanwhile, Hamas and the other resistance movements would say, okay, we're not going to take this anymore. We're going to have a say in this at the appropriate moment. And of course, they were preparing to teach the Israelis that they don't have an invincible army, that what they have is this policy of trying to always humiliate and take over and deny the Palestinian their rights, that will have consequences. That will have a cost associated with it. So they were planning for this, of course, and this for the first time in the history of the conflict, where for the first time Israel is really surprised. They were surprised back in 1973, but this was Israel against two armies who never really had the capacity to push back. Yes, they're surprised they were able to get in, but eventually Israel was able to repel them and end with a political stalemate. But this time around, Israel was actually defeated by a bunch of militias. I mean, these people do not have planes, they don't have missiles, they don't have bombs, they don't have tanks, they don't have artillery. All what they have was just determination that they're going to go. They outmaneuvered their enemies, and they were able to get in there and fight and defeat them and defeat their intelligence services. And when I talk about defeat them, this was a fight that they thought was going to take a full day, and it was over in 3 hours. So most of the chaos that took place on October 7th is because the Israelis were totally surprised, and they were caught there with their pants down, and they were able to actually defeat the unit that has been torturing them and tormenting them for years. It is called the Gaza team. This Gaza team, which is composed of hundreds of soldiers, that's what they were doing. They were the ones who were denying Gazans their rights, who were tormenting them, bombing them, and doing everything. They targeted them as well as different military bases, and they were able to get hundreds of them. Now, because this ended early than they thought, of course, part of this also was to apprehend as many soldiers as prisoners, because that's the only thing that make Israel to exchange prisoners. Let me give you a story here. Back in 1993 and 94, when there was this Oslo Accord, part of the agreement with the Palestinian Authority was that eventually, since this is a new page in the history of Palestinian-Israeli conflict, that the Israelis would release all the Palestinian prisoners. And this was part of the so-called peace settlement. You know what? They never released Palestinians because of that. The only time they would release Palestinians is when Palestinians have Israeli soldiers. And that happened back in 2000, I believe, and 6. They were able to get one Israeli soldier from outside Gaza, and they were able to hide him pretty well. And then after 5 years, after Israel failed to get him out, they were able to release 1,047 Palestinian prisoners. So the Palestinians know from their experience that the only way they can get relief for the Palestinian prisoners, including women and children inside the prisons, is that if they apprehend Israeli soldiers or Israeli settlers. And that's what happened. Part of this operation was to go and get some soldiers so that they can get the people out. And I said, there are thousands of people. And by the way, since October 7th, I told you before that there were 5,500. Today, it's over 8,000. Yes, they released 300 last week, but at the same time, they took about 3,500 in the West Bank, including children. And we talk about people that they killed from the beginning of the year to October 6th, even in the West Bank. Well, there's no Hamas. I mean, you cannot claim Hamas in the West Bank. And yet, hundreds of people were killed. About 400 people were killed since October 7th in the West Bank alone. So no one can claim Hamas. And do you think any thought Hamas, this is because of Hamas, they're trying to hide Hamas? Back in the 48 or in the aftermath of 1967, in 1970, I found a headline in one of the newspapers, Jordanian newspapers, in which Israel was trying to displace. They were bombing also Gaza and trying to displace them and move them towards Egypt. That happened before even Hamas was created, 17 years before Hamas was created. So this is a policy that has been pushed by every successive Israeli government as much as they could, how they can dispossess the Palestinians and how can they displace as many of the Palestinians, because the Zionist project calls for a country that is purified of the indigenous people as much as possible. And that's basically what this is about. Now, let me get back to the role of the U.S. The United States came after World War II, obviously, as the greatest or the most powerful country on the planet, and it created this order that we see today, this political order, And of course, for the first 4 decades after World War II, between the late 40s and late 80s, we had the Cold War. And the United States, strategically speaking, had 3 geographic areas where it thinks its interests lie. During the Cold War, it was Europe. Number 2 was the Gulf and the Middle East. And number 3, East Asia. And the reason it sees Europe and East Asia as important, vital geographic interests is because both have great powers. And the United States does not like great powers because great powers could come and dominate the region. And if they dominate the region, they could come back and compete with the US in different parts of the world. So what it does, usually, its policy is to go to these countries in their region and try to create what they call a balance of power coalition. They just bring other states that could be in conflict with these great powers and trying to visit them. And from that prism, you can understand what US policy was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They saw Russia as a possible great power, although it was very weak at the time. So they continued to enlarge NATO further and further. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was about 16 members of NATO. And today we have about 30, and we're about to become 32 with Finland and Sweden. And this was basically created so that they can contain Russia and push. And there was absolutely no reason why they should get Ukraine to become there, because they knew this was a red line, but they didn't care, because the idea was just to push the Russians, hopefully, eventually, that they could actually topple their system and hopefully integrate with the Western-dominated or the American-dominated Western system. And of course, they're willing to fight until the last Ukrainian for that take place. And this is a war of attrition against Russia. I think it's a strategic mistake. Many people think, not me, that this is a strategic mistake because the real competitor is not in Europe today. It's in East Asia. So East Asia today is the first concern of the United States because of the rise of China. But the idea, which also failed when the US was unipolar, the only great power in the system between 1991 and about when Trump took office, about a quarter of a century, it was the US policy at the time is that if we can open up to China and if they can flourish economically, then their system will also change and then they will become under our domination. They never contemplated the fact that you could have a totalitarian political system and at the same time you have a market-oriented economy. So they made a strategic mistake where you actually have a totalitarian system where they are willing to compete and become rival of the US and at the same time become powerful economically. When they woke up to this fact, it was too late. So they wanted to reorient themselves and reposition themselves to go and start containing China. And that brings us to the second most important geographic area, which it didn't change, neither during the Cold War nor now, which is the Gulf area and the Middle East. The reason this area is very important, basically 2 main strategic reasons. One, it's because of oil and gas. Oil and gas are the most important strategic commodities on the planet. And if the United States can control that oil, and most of the sources of that energy is in this part of the world, for much of the previous century, it was about 70%. Today, you have also Venezuela and Russia competing for that. But still, significant amount of oil exists in that part, and particularly in parts which have very little populations, you know, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, United Arab Emirates, and then a little bit in Iraq, and of course in Iran. These are the major producing oil countries. And if the US can control this, then it can control basically the world's economy. But on top of that, when the US delinked the dollar from the gold, this came during Nixon in 1971, it had to replace this, otherwise the dollar would have a free fall. And the agreement was with the between King Faisal and Kissinger at the time is that in return for protection, the Saudis would insist, and they were the largest producing at the time, they would insist on only selling oil in dollars. And that is the secret, is that if you can sell oil in dollars, then we will be able to print as many dollars and we get away with it. So believe it or not, and of course you believe it, you live it actually, since George Washington in 1792 until Ronald Reagan's second term of 1985, that's almost 200 years of history, your debt, your national debt, reached about $1 trillion. And in the next 38 years, that's less than 4 decades, today we're approaching $32 trillion. Yet the dollar is still the strongest currency in the world. It accounts to about 62% of the world trade and about 80% of financial transactions. If you want to ask yourself how that is the case, how can we print that much money and still be on top of the world? It's because of this power that, first of all, the oil is sold in dollars, and also you control many of the institutions, and you have 7 fleets roaming the world every single day, threatening everybody. So no one can actually raise their head and try to threaten you or to stand up to you. I mean, the American military and the American government. And the second reason is Israel, because Israel is not just a foreign policy issue for the United States. Israel also a domestic issue because of the power of the lobby within the United States. No one can deny the fact that the Israeli lobby is one of the most influential and most powerful, and that they can actually have a lot of weight and a lot of power within the power circles, the power elites, whether that is political, military, cultural, media, banking, you name it. I mean, that's the case. And that's not an anti-Semitic thing, as they would try you to believe, because that what it is just, you can read a book by Mearsheimer and Walton Mearsheimer, which came about 2007, I believe. They call it the lobby, in which they put forth the actual machinations of this lobby. Also, there are 2 books that were written by Zionist Jews themselves. I mean, they didn't. I don't know about Goldberg, but certainly Eric Waltman is no longer an ardent Zionist. One is called one is called Jewish Power, which came in 1995, in which he lays out the whole, and he's a Zionist. He lays the whole process of how Jews became very powerful, and of course they're proud of it, and how they manipulate the system. And that's the point. This is not about Jews. This is about Zionist manipulation of the system and society. And the other one is called We're Not One, just came last year, by Eric Alterman, in which he is a Nations columnist and a historian, and he talks about the history of also Zionist ascendance to power. So all these things no one can deny. So Israel is no longer just a foreign policy issue where the United States is using Israel as a club to hit the head of those who would, I wouldn't call it threaten it, but stand up to its excesses as an imperialist power. But it's also the one that also have a lot of weight, domestically speaking, in terms of the lobby, politically and economically and media and so on and so forth. So what the United States wanted to do was to, after the failure of US policies in the Middle East, see, when you are a unipolar in the system, you are the only power in the system, you can try things and get away with them when they fail. So when the US was, during that quarter of century, the only power in the system, they wanted to come to the Middle East, to the Islamic world, to the Arab world, and start social engineering, try to make these people more, quote unquote, civilized, more Western, to get rid of their fanaticism and so on and so forth. And of course, that failed miserably in Afghanistan and even more so in Iraq. So they had to withdraw. They didn't really pay much in terms of that, even though they spent $3 or $4 trillion and about perhaps as much as 5,500 people in Afghanistan and Iraq and perhaps more. But still, they didn't really pay heavily for this. So when China came around, and now they need to contain it, so they need to leave this area and try to focus more on China. So to do that, they needed to bring their proxies to take over the area here in order to protect American interests. And to do that, they wanted to integrate Israel into their allies. So that's why you saw during Trump what is called the Abraham Accords. These are Arab regimes which are not elected by anybody. They are basically fiefdoms, some families who ruling basically big oil states, but also they are ruthless leaders who have very tight relationship with the US, and in exchange for protection, they are allowed to do whatever they want within their own countries. And of course, they started what they call the Abraham Accords. So they signed treaties, normalization treaties, even though the Arabs came back in 2002 under an initiative called the Arab Peace Initiative, in which they said, okay, we're willing to recognize Israel. If Israel is willing to withdraw from the 1967 areas, then we'll recognize it. It will be integrated in our system. Everybody will be happy. The Palestinians will have a state, so on and so forth. Israel said, no, thank you. We're not interested in any of that. We're going to take the whole land. Who cares about your recognition? So nothing happened out of this. So the Arabs, Netanyahu kept saying that, don't worry about it. They will come around. We are their gate to the White House. They cannot do anything without getting to us first. And he gambled on that, and he thought he won. So he got his normalization deals through Trump with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and he was working on other countries like Sudan and Mauritania and Oman and so on and so forth. But the jewel of the crown would have been Saudi Arabia because of the symbolism. Saudi Arabia is the seat where seat of the two most important cities in Islam are, Mecca and Medina, and of course because of its enormous wealth and prestige within the Muslim countries. So I said, I can totally sidestep the Palestinian issue. I don't even have to give the Palestinians anything. All what I have to do is to have this normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, and then the United States, you can reposition yourself and concentrate on China. Leave me, Israel, and my allies, our new allies, to take over of this area. And those who are giving you trouble, like Iran and some of these resistance movements, some of these extremist movements in Lebanon and Palestine and Iraq and Syria and Yemen, we'll take care of them. And they were preparing for this. For next spring would have been the time where there would be a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel. They will take over. Everybody would be happy with it, and they will throw to the Palestinians some crumbs, some money. Of course, that wasn't going to happen, and that's why the strategic importance of what happened October the 7th. All these things have stopped. Now, let me just say a couple of words about the consequences of what happened and the scenarios of what happened on October 7th. First of all, as I said, the resistance did everything possible to get any kind of resolution, lifting the siege, starting the incursions, trying to reason with them on Jerusalem. And none of that, no one was listening. Certainly not the United States. No one really cared. The prisoners, no one really cared. And what you see today is a complete double standard. Now, we've heard so much accusations about what actually happened on October the 7th. And I don't have the time actually to go over lie after lie after lie, particularly when it kept being repeated, not only by the President of the United States and his lieutenants, but also throughout the media. There were no rapes on that day. These are all lies. There were no beheading of babies. These were all lies. No one was targeted because he was a Jew. That is a lie. The fact of the matter is, many of the Israelis, the civilians who were killed, they were killed by their own army. Because what happened during the chaos, once the headquarters of the air base that was controlling the whole region collapsed, and they gave up. They couldn't communicate with each other. So the other units were called in, and they started shooting not only at resistance fighters, but also they started shooting at their own citizens. That's why many of these people, they were burned without recognition. Do you think the Palestinians had the weapons or the ability to shoot at them and burn them? Of course not. These were Hellfire missiles coming from helicopter gunships. And that's why that number came from 1,400 to 1,200, because they recognized after the fact, weeks after the fact, that 200 of the dead people were Hamas. So are you telling me now that Hamas actually burned themselves? I mean, does that make any sense to anybody? So many of these civilians actually were killed by the Israeli army themselves in the midst of this great chaos, including, of course, many of these people were at the festival, so-called festival. And of course, many reports came that detailed this, including Israeli newspapers. So unfortunately, what you have here is a propaganda machine within the United States in order to let people be lulled and accept that a genocide is being taken place. Now, let me tell you that this is a very methodical genocide. Some people object to the fact this is not genocide. I don't know what genocide is. If you don't go there and target, and this came actually in an Israeli magazine and website. It's called Plus 972. It's in English. You can read it. And 972 is the area code of Israel, in which it says that every single casualty, every single victim in Gaza, they know exactly who are they going to kill. You don't make mistakes by killing every single day children and women and civilians. You make a mistake 1 day, 2 days, 3, not 60 days continuously. And we know that this is going to happen also tomorrow and day after tomorrow and day after tomorrow. So this is methodical way of trying to kill the Palestinians and trying to displace the Palestinians and try to run them down, take them to the border, try to force expulsion of from Gaza. And you're also targeting not just power plants and water salination plants and bakeries and hospitals and clinics and schools and universities and parks and shops and buildings. I mean, this is very methodical, neighborhood by neighborhood. They know exactly what they do. The Israelis know where every person and how many people live in that house from their birth until they die, because they have that information. So this is done very deliberately with the help of the Americans. The Americans are not oblivious to this. They are not surprised by this. They know exactly what's happening, and they are complicit in this crime. And it's just beyond someone's imagination that a country that goes around the world lecturing about human rights, about democracy, about rule of law, about Ukraine and how terrible the Russians are, what they're doing to Ukraine. Keep in mind that the number of children, this is not mine, this is what the UN Secretary General says, that in 7 years being the Secretary General, he receives a report at the end of every year of how many children are killed in the war. And he says the worst offenders were Taliban in Afghanistan, Russia in Ukraine, Bashar in Syria. And he said all these countries combined, when I combine their record in a yearly basis, not on a few months basis, all of them will dwarf combined, because the largest one country had like 700. Ukraine killed like 350 children. Russia killed about 350 children. They killed 6,000 Palestinians in 2 months. And that does not even account to the people under the rubble. So there is nothing compared in recent memory or recent history of what's going on. And yet, when you listen to politicians, US politicians, when you listen to the administration officials, and you can't think, but these people are totally heartless. These people are, I don't know what is the right word. Are they racist? They don't think. They think that these. I think if they were killing animals, if they were killing dogs and cats and birds and rabbits, they would have probably more sympathy in their heart. They would probably be more outraged than what's going on today. Yet they don't even lose sleep over it. I remember one of the administration officials who was quoted in one of these articles, I think it might have been Politico or The Hill or something, in which he says he doesn't sleep at night. He doesn't sleep at night because an American child by the name of, I think, Amy or something like that, he can't sleep because he's thinking constantly about her. And she was like 3-year-old. And I'm thinking, here's a guy, he can't sleep because there's an American who is a hostage, who is a captive, and I'm sure she's being protected and clothed and fed, and he doesn't care about thousands of Palestinian children. I mean, what kind of a person is this? So he's looking. You could see that he's looking at this as not human beings. He's like looking at cockroaches and a human being. This he can't have. He does not have a sleep. He can't sleep over thinking about someone, what happened to her, and of course she was released. Totally safe, safely, and he has no problem killing Palestinians every single day. So that's the situation you have today. It's not double standard. I mean, double standard, you can say, about, applying double standard here and there, but this is deliberate war crimes that the US has been involved in. It's a deliberate genocide that's taking place. When you deny people, not just under bombardment, you provide them with all the weapons at your disposal, even weapons that you deny your closest allies. But you deny them food, and deny them water, and deny them medical supplies, and deny them medical equipment, and deny them fuel, and deny them electricity, and you deny them internet. I mean, what else? I don't know what genocide is. If this is not genocide, I don't know if that word would have any meaning, actually, because it would be devoid of any meaning if it is not applied in this situation. And yet you look at all this and you see the resilience of the Palestinian people. I mean, this is just amazing that they were trying to pressure the Palestinians so much that they will give up, their fight, that they will give up and say, okay, here's the white flag, what you can do. No, they're willing to actually sacrifice, not that because they love death, but because they love the principle. They love justice, and they love the fact that they are not going to give up against this brutality, against this criminality, against this barbarity and this savagery, that they were willing to endure and pay the cost because they love freedom, and they love that the fact that their issue is not going to be sacrificed at the altar of a racist supremacist ideology. So I think I spoke too much. I said a lot. I'm sure I missed some as well. So hopefully we can take that under the questions and answers. Thank you very much.